we're now going to talk about how we protect the brain. Of course, the brain is a very vital organ, so we want to make sure that it has as much protection as you can. Of course, there's the skull, but if there was nothing between the skull and the brain actually has a consistency of like jelly, so imagine that pushing against the skull would actually damage the brain itself. So we have these layers called meninges. Meninges are layers of connective tissue, and these connective tissues are going to surround the brain and protect it. So there's going to be 3 meninges. So right here you have the scalp, and then underneath that you have the skull right here. And then under the skull you're going to have the brain. So between the skull and the brain we're going to have 3 meninges. The outermost layer is called the dura mater. So this right here, this is the dura mater. The dura mater is the toughest of the layers. It's very thick and hard to puncture. So dura actually means tough. And that's the most superficial meninge, the most protective. We always know the outermost layer is the most protective. After that, we have the arachnoid matter. So this is the meninge that's in the middle. And if you notice, it actually has these little lines coming out of it that almost look like spider web. That's going to allow for a space underneath this arachnoid matter. So arachnoid, if you think about it, actually means spider. For instance, like arachnophobia is a fear of spiders. So it gets its name because it has those white line projections which look like spider webs. And then the last matter is called pia mater. So here's the brain. The pia mater is the thinnest of the layer, very delicate, and it rests right on top of the brain. Pia actually means soft. So you guys might know cellophane, right? Or saran wrap. That's exactly what pia mater is like. It's so flexible that it actually hugs the brain so tight. It goes through every gyrus and into every sulci. So it wraps the actual brain and touches the actual brain really tightly, and it's super thin and easy to puncture. Now we're going to talk about a different type of protection of the brain, and this comes from cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. It's mostly water, and the reason why it's important for protection is it actually provides buoyancy to the brain. And buoyancy is the ability to float. For instance, think of like a little kid in water. You put those little floaties on the arm. That would be providing the kid buoyancy. So when you provide the brain buoyancy, it floats, which means it's not going to actually just sit on the skull. In fact, because it's floating, the brain's weight is actually reduced by about 97%. So it's basically just floating inside of the skull. Another thing that the cerebrospinal fluid is important for is that it actually nourishes the brain. So it actually has a lot of nutrients in it. So it's going to be important to watch the CSF circulate throughout the brain and also the spinal cord so you can get that nourishment to it. So let's follow the path of cerebrospinal fluid and see where it comes from and where it goes. So cerebrospinal fluid is produced by the blood. So the choroid plexus is the structure that actually makes the CSF fluid. So right here you can see in red, and here, and also down here, you can see choroid plexus. And the reason why it's red is because it actually pulls from the blood the CSF fluid, which is a lot of water and, again, nutrients. So after the choroid plexus actually makes the CSF fluid, it'll flow through the ventricle. So remember, for instance, if it's made here, it'll flow through the lateral ventricle, then the third, the cerebral aqueduct, the fourth ventricle. From the ventricles, it will flow to what we call the subarachnoid space. So remember, the arachnoid matter, which was that middle layer of meninge, sub, of course, means below. So the subarachnoid space is that space below the arachnoid matter, which is why there were those little spiderweb projections to keep that space open. And the important thing about that space is that after the CSF goes through the ventricles, it comes out of the ventricles, and then notice out here, all surrounding the brain, this is all the subarachnoid space. So the CSF fluid goes around the entire brain, which is why the brain is floating in the CSF fluid. After it goes throughout the entire subarachnoid space, the CSF goes into what we call the arachnoid villi. So these little projections right here. And from the arachnoid villi, the CSF gets recycled back into the blood. that the CSF is constantly flowing, and it comes from the blood and it gets recycled back into the blood. And you need it to recycle because you need to get fresh CSF with fresh nutrients. In fact, your brain makes about a half a cup of CSF every hour. So you can imagine throughout the day, you'll probably produce at least 8 cups of CSF fluid. Later, when we study the spinal cord, you'll see that CSF can also go straight down the spinal cord. And when you do a spinal tap, you're getting into that CSF fluid from the spinal cord. So now I'm going to tell you about hydrocephalus, which is a problem when you don't regulate the amount of CSF that you make. So, like I said, you should always be making CSF, but then also recycling it. And it should be at the same rate. How much you make should be how much you recycle. So you always have the same amount of CSF flowing. However, hydrocephalus is a problem in which you make too much CSF and you don't recycle enough. So there's a buildup of CSF either in the ventricle or in the subarachnoid space. So hydro means water, and then cephalus refers to the brain or the head. So remember, CSF is mostly water, so that's why it gets the name hydrocephalus. So this child you see right here, you'll notice has a very enlarged head at the top. And the reason is, as a child, the skull bones are still forming and there's still those gaps in between, those fetal fontanelles. So the skull is actually expanding to accommodate for the buildup of CSF, which is why the head looks so large. So if you catch this early enough, it's actually a fairly easy problem to solve. All you have to do is put a shunt in, like basically a little needle, and drain the excess CSF fluid. And then that would help solve the problem. And over time, usually the child then begins to regulate the production of CSF appropriately. So you actually only see this scenario normally in countries where you don't have easy access to medical treatment. So hydrocephalus, you wouldn't see that commonly in America. All right, so now I have a true or false question for you guys. Too much pressure in the subdural space may damage the brain. So let's take a look here. Here is the subdural space, so underneath the skull, underneath the dura mater, the outer layer. Let's say you actually had an injury here, such as bleeding, right? If you had a trauma to the head and you get bleeding, and that builds up underneath the subdural space, that's going to cause pressure on the brain. And that pressure on the brain, look what's happening to the cortex. Right? So this situation can definitely cause damage. So this is true. So one of the easiest ways to get that pressure buildup is if you have that internal bleeding right there. So that leads us to actually one of the disorders of the protection of the brain. And this is called a TBI, a traumatic brain injury. And this is actually the most common way to injure the brain. It's basically when you have a sharp blow to the head. You have a trauma to the head. So, for instance, your kid riding a bike is the reason why you wear the helmet, right? The idea if you fall, you could hit your head and suffer a TBI. So here's another example, right? For instance, boxers, right? They get punched in the head all the time. They definitely will be suffering TBI. So let me show you 2 examples of hemorrhaging. Hemorrhage is when you're bleeding. So here we have an epidural hemorrhage. Remember, epi means on the outside. So this is above the dura mater. And then here, this is a subdural hemorrhage, like the cartoon drawing I just showed you. So this is below the dura mater. Both of them, again, leading to pressure on the brain, which could cause damage. Right. The last protective mechanism of the brain I want to tell you about is the blood-brain barrier. So this is what it sounds like. It's a barrier between the blood vessels in the brain with the rest of the brain. So the reason why it's really important is because not everything in your blood is actually suitable to be in the environment of the brain. So certain things are actually toxic to the brain that might not be to other parts of your body. So this blood-brain barrier makes sure that nothing toxic for the brain will enter. So it helps maintain a stable environment for the brain. And you might remember those astrocyte cells, which are neuroglia. Remember, their main job was to help with this blood-brain barrier. Importantly, the blood-brain barrier is selectively permeable. So in other words, you select what permeates or what goes through. So again, the idea that you only want nutrients to leave the blood and enter the brain, and then you would want to selectively put waste from the brain back into the blood, therefore helping the brain keep a nice, safe environment. So when you don't have a good blood-brain barrier or something happens and, for instance, a blood vessel breaks, that's when you get what we call a cerebrovascular accident. So cerebral for the brain and then vascular for the blood vessel. So this is abbreviated as CVA, most commonly known as a stroke. So a stroke happens to be when you have a blockage of blood flow. So for whatever reason, part of the blood flow is blocked. That's called an ischemia when it's actually blocked. And specifically for a stroke, the block is going to a brain area. So for example, here you have oxygenated blood trying to get to the brain, deliver nutrients, and then right here you have the actual blockage, right, the ischemia. So notice now this brain area beyond the block is now not receiving any blood flow. So it's temporarily receiving no blood, which of course, if that happens over a long period of time, there could be some damage to that brain area, which may or may not be able to be repaired depending on how bad the damage is. Now, in a CAT scan here, we're actually looking at a coronal or frontal section of the brain. And so this here on the left is a healthy brain. And then here on the right, notice right here, this abnormal kind of gray whitish spot. So that would be where the cerebrovascular accident happened or the stroke happened. So this brain area was denied the new, fresh, oxygenated blood. And so wherever the stroke occurs, depending on that brain area, will depend on what functions you see that are lost. So a lot of times strokes occur to the brain areas that are right by the precentral and postcentral gyrus, which is why a lot of times you can see issues with movement on stroke patients because the postcentral gyrus, remember, is important for sensation, and the precentral gyrus is important for movement. So just to summarize the second part of the brain lecture, talking about protection, we know the brain is protected by meninges, CSF, and the blood-brain barrier. Disorders involve disrupting CSF and blood flow.